Mining is one of the industries that built this country, and today Canadian companies operate resource extraction interests in more than 100 countries globally. But in some of those places, not everyone is rolling out the welcome mat for those companies putting down roots and mine shafts. That is the case for some in the Philippines, and here to explain their concerns, we welcome Bishop Antonio Ablon of the Philippine Independent Church in the Diocese of Pagadian City in Zamboanga del Sur, Annie Bautista, National Coordinator, Ecumenical Voice for Peace and Human Rights in the Philippines, and Emily Dwyer, Coordinator, Canadian Network on Corporate Accountability, and we're grateful all of you could make some time for us here via TVO this evening for our discussion. Annie, I want to go to you first here. You are concerned about alleged human rights violations in the mining business in the Philippines that have a Canadian connection. Tell me your list of concerns. What's on that list?
One is the ongoing extrajudicial killings among the community people and community leaders in our country. Second is ongoing bombing of communities in areas that have mining concessions.
Bombing?
Yes.
By whom?
We have since March 16, we have seen some reports of bombings done by Armed Forces of the Philippines in areas that have mining activities.
Bombing how?
How? From helicopters. Bombs have been thrown into the villages.
Bishop Antonio, I'd like to follow up with you on this. Do you have proof that A, these things are happening, and B, that you know who's doing them?
It's in the news, and our people in the villages are telling us that these are happening. And it's coming from the helicopters of the armed forces. In the Philippines, there is no other group with having helicopters and can have the capacity to do such things.
And what is their motive, do you believe?
We have this pattern all over, has been done before. That whenever there is a company, would it be logging, for hydro, and for mining and plantations, it would be first entered with military operations in pursuit of insurgents. But later on, we'll just know 2 weeks or months that there is mining company who is going up to the villages or the communities of the indigenous peoples and farmers.
But I'm trying to get to the bottom of why you think whoever's doing this is doing this. What's the end game here?
It's the mining, and it's been done before.
You think the mining company is dropping bombs on villages?
No.
Okay.
But it's because mining companies or mining industries are usually having the security which is coming from the armed forces and the paramilitary. And you will find detachments in the concessions, within the concessions of these mining companies.
But just so I'm clear, your concern is that the Philippine government is turning a blind eye to all of this?
Yes, and of course they are cooperating with the mining industries since 1995. When the Congress or passed the law on mining, which opened up the entry of huge number of foreign mining companies in the Philippines.
Emily, what's your interest in this?
I coordinate a network called the Canadian Network on Corporate Accountability, who brings together 30 organizations from various sectors across Canada, who are concerned about the human rights and environmental impacts of Canadian mining companies around the world, and about Canada's obligation to ensure that companies bearing our name are respecting human rights when they're operating. And what Annie and Bishop Oblong are describing in the Philippines is part of a pattern that we're seeing of widespread allegations of serious human rights abuses in every part of the world.
Now, you know, of course, that the company involved, one of the first things they say is, we're not a Canadian company, so this really doesn't have a Canadian angle, in their view. What's your response to that?
Canada is the home of 60% of the Canadian mining, oil and gas companies around the world are headquartered here, and there are subsidiaries and affiliates of those companies operating right around the world. And companies that are their parent companies in Canada do have a responsibility to ensure that their subsidiaries are behaving properly, but through due diligence processes throughout their supply chains. Sorry.
No, I hear you, but the company involved says actually the Canadian outfit is the subsidiary and that the head office, the main company, is not a Canadian company. That's their position. Do you have any reason to dispute that?
Headquarters in Calgary.
Annie, go ahead.
I know that one of the mining companies that are in the Philippines have their headquarters in Canada and are listed in the Toronto Stock Exchange. So it's impossible to say that it's not in Canada.
So maybe you think they're doing some kind of corporate jiggery-pokery here? Can I put it that way?
What I can say is that there have been a lot of interconnections among the corporations, and actually it's very difficult to really say, to really, pinpoint where the major investments are coming in, because this is all interconnected multinational corporations all over the globe. But as we have noticed, some of the mining corporations in the Philippines are listed in the Toronto Stock Exchange and have headquarters in Canada.
What are they trying to mine?
Nickel is one of the main minerals, and then gold.
And have they got mine shafts in the ground yet?
Yes, they have. In the area of Bishop Ablon, they have mine shafts in one community, and then they transferred to another community once that community has been mined.
Yep. First, they came to Zamboanga del Norte, in Siocon, Mount Canatuan, in the early 2000. Then after that, they are now transferred to the Zamboanga del Sur. So it's after maybe there's no more mineral ore in the area. So they have to transfer. And what's happening is that they have this so-called for the people project, clinics, the bus, and many others. But when they left, it's all gone.
So all of those extra things left with them.
Yes, yes. So that's the problem actually in the area. So you already have displaced people, you already have make people miserable, and there are records of deaths of these people, of killings. And you cannot undo that. That's already done.
How many mining jobs are involved here?
According to our last survey, if there are 115,000 in whole Philippines only, you can have 3 million plus in agriculture and fisheries. So comparing that, because Philippines is largely a agriculture land, it's the promise of jobs, the promise of economic growth with these mining companies is not fulfilled at all. It's just a promise.
But I guess what I'm trying to understand is, do the people who have the jobs, do they want you involved, or are they content to do the mining and get a paycheck?
They wanted to do the mining themselves, not the foreign companies. Because in our case, in Zamboanga del Sur, there have already been a mining tradition. There have been small-scale miners. And they are paying taxes. They were illegal then. They were legal then. But when this mining company came into the picture, they've been declared illegal. So in favor of the mining companies outside of the Philippines, foreign mining companies, our people are now suffering. In fact, I said, your investment is killing our people in the ground, especially the indigenous people.
Is there a Canadian role in this?
There's absolutely a Canadian role. Canada should be investigating and monitoring what companies based in Canada are doing around the world.
And when you say Canada, who is that? Who should be investigating?
The Government of Canada.
Government of Canada.
The Government of Canada should create an ombudsperson. It's something that's been a call from civil society in Canada and around the world for over a decade. An independent investigation of Canadian mining, oil and gas companies, allegations of human rights abuses associated with those companies around the world. And I think when you were talking about mine workers, I thought it was also, it's interesting to note that many of the members of our network represent Canadian mine workers, so like the Steelworkers Humanity Fund, for example, and Unifor, and have partners around the world who are are mine workers. And then the letters that we've received from around the world calling on the Canadian government to take action, to introduce mechanisms to hold companies to account. There have been many, many organizations of mine workers, such as Industrial, which represents 50 million Canadian mine workers around the world, who are calling on Canada to ensure that companies are respecting workers' rights and respecting the environment and human rights.
Emily, do you know if any other countries around the world have this kind of ombudsperson whose job it is to consider extraterritorial business problems?
There's not an example exactly of this anywhere else in the world. There's a lot of reasons why Canada should be a leader in this. As I mentioned before, 60% of Canadian mining, or mining oil and gas companies around the world are Canadian. And Canada is one of 3 countries that is being identified as companies based in our country are particularly linked to attacks on human rights defenders.
But for those who say this is all taking place halfway around the world, it's actually not taking place in Canada. Therefore, shouldn't it really be the responsibility of the government of the Philippines to ensure the safety of workplaces, the safety of the people partaking, the integrity of the entire operation? What would you say to that?
Host countries do have an important role to play. Home states also have an incredibly important role, particularly given the extent to which the Canadian government is financing, promoting, and supporting the development of these projects. They are part of their international human rights obligations are to ensure that Canadian companies are respecting international human rights around the world.
I'm curious, Annie, you know, the Philippines has a rather controversial, I think is a mild way of putting it, leader right now, Duterte, who has, you know, declared war on much of the population and has apparently been responsible for the deaths of thousands of people in his effort to take on the drug issue, etc. Do you have any hope that he is, first of all, even knows about this issue, and secondly, plans to do anything about it?
We know that he knows about it because he has been speaking about it in most of his TV and radio interviews, and even with the media. Whether he will do something about it would require a lot of pressure from the people themselves, because right now we know that there are about 7,000 have been killed in Metro Manila, and most of these, or 99%, are poor people, and they are afraid to come out. They are afraid to go against what has been happening to them. But recently, we in the churches, in the ecumenical movement, we were able to gather families to come and look and go to the authorities, go to the courts, go to the Department of National Defense and say that, hey, we are not happy with what is happening. And we are also planning to go to President Duterte himself.
You're planning to do that?
Yes.
Have you met with anybody in his government yet?
We have met with Department of Justice.
And how did that meeting go?
It's not very, well, they just say we will look into it, we'll make inquiries, but that's not a very fruitful mechanism.
Emily, I presume that if your request to create this ombudsperson who would have this kind of responsibility to look beyond Canada's shores at how the corporate world was behaving beyond Canada's shores, I mean, that would take some time to set up. And I presume you want some action on this sooner than that. So what in the immediate future could the Government of Canada do, short of setting up this entirely new officer, to address some of the concerns you've laid out today?
It shouldn't take very long to set this up. It's part of a long process. All of the major political parties committed to create an ombudsperson during the federal election campaign. Our network developed model legislation that worked through all of the details in terms of how to set up such an office.
Well, hang on. You got to draft the legislation. You got to pass the legislation. You got to put it out for, for potential candidates. You got to interview candidates. You got to hire a candidate. Then you got to set up an office. Then they got to staff an office. Then it would take some time. But I presume that could take a year. Could take 2 years.
Having a public statement from our government indicating that they are more than expecting, but they will actually be acting to ensure that Canadian companies are respecting human rights around the world. Right now we have two mechanisms in Canada that purport to deal with these issues, the CSR Councillor's Office and the National Contact Point.
CSR, Corporate Social Responsibility?
Corporate Social Responsibility, sorry. In these sectors, we talk about within acronyms
we are
way
an
too often.
acronym-free zone here. Yeah.
And both of those mechanisms, all that you can get is the chance to sit down at the table and talk with the companies. And when there are serious human rights abuses involved, having the chance to talk with the company is simply not enough. So as a first step, having a public announcement, a public statement indicating that the government is moving beyond mechanisms that are working just on dialogue and actually moving towards binding, mandatory mechanisms to hold corporations to account would be a signal to companies that would start to be an important incentive to change behavior.
Which cabinet minister do you think is responsible for this?
Minister Champagne is the Minister of International Trade, who is, according to the Prime Minister's office, the ministry responsible. We also know that the Ministers of International Development, Bibeau, and the Minister of Foreign Affairs are all looking very closely on this file.
Have you met with any of them?
We've met with advisors of all of those offices.
Advisors of all of them?
Yes.
Annie, let's finish up on this. I wonder whether you are, I appreciate the human rights concerns, obviously, but I wonder whether you are against mining in the Philippines at all.
We are not against mining because we know that mining would help improve the industries of our country. The Philippines is a very rich has very rich mineral resources, and we know that once these are mined properly, once these are developed properly in our country, then our industries would be improved. But then what we don't want, I'll go to what we don't want. We don't want that companies that they only mine our country and take out all the ore or even the soil, because now it's not only the ore that is being taken out, it's even the soil that is being taken out. And probably we're joking that part of our provinces would now be in other countries of the world. And because of that, they don't mine properly, and then they don't spend the profit that they earned from our mines in our country itself. So that is what we do not want.
Understood. My thanks to the three of you for laying your case out tonight here on TVO. Bishop Ablon from the Philippine Independent Church, Annie Bautista from the Ecumenical Voice for Peace and Human Rights in the Philippines, Emily Dwyer, the coordinator from the Canadian Network on Corporate Accountability. And one last note just before we finish here, we should say for the record that we did invite the Mining Association of Canada to participate in this discussion with all of us here tonight at TVO, and they declined our invitation. And we also asked the company involved whether they had anything to say about this, and their position was, quote, given that TVI Pacific is currently a minority shareholder in the Philippines, our management has decided to forego the possibility of an interview on the agenda. So 2 no's from them, but we're grateful to all of you for joining us here tonight. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.